When I say that some will do be friendly t-údar gan measc after still were raised on from short my ship was taught ihe tá go leor daoine sna tétarna ag gaol. Ach tá Aindrias treis roiin coinne dhéanana dúm síos trí na bhéinte agus tá an buich as údar agus staraí bhfuil nearfáilte ag do chus céim ach go háire tí chló í snudí. Tá ábhar fáilte ag an gcónaíoch Marx Engels Canary néad ag séad ag an nascaid an gaige agus strachan na Saoirse agus neart eile bheith cuairmach go leor dhaoine as an chlár rinne sé néad ag séad seach na Cásca agus céad léinn de Comóra néad ag séad ag teanna den an sin. Dá siúd nach áildaobh seo an do fríorsí is an áit a bhí conaí na drithair a Pierce trád á raibh agus bhí conaí a ahar an seo. Bhí sé mar séirchluchaí, so bhí siad an seo tús na fithi uaise. So tá cinál tábhacht ag an ionad seo mar áit starúil is stair na gaige agus a chathair. So thanks for coming out on a night that there's a lot of people in the builders. Aindrias here has done a good few talks for us down the years for Mishnah. He's an author and historian who's well known in the Irish language world and outside. He's published on various topics, Marx, Engels, Connolly especially, as well. He's looked at the link between the Irish language and the struggle for freedom. He also was or wrote and devised or produced a very popular documentary there as the 1916 commemoration approached back in 2013, I think it was, Néad ag séad ag seach na Cásca. For those who don't know, this building has great significance in the Irish language world because it's where the two Pierce brothers spent a portion of their youth. Their father was a stonemason here at the start of the 20th century, so we like to use it for Irish language events and I think has a historical resonance. So scuoine mé le Aindrias coin faoi Máirtín Ó Cadhain, níos dar nóí tá tábhacht leith ag an coinach don Mishnah an dream aige seo a nocht agus denny Aindrias an nascaid or Poblachtánach agus an coinach a phlé. So we'll let Aindrias take over now. Ó Cadhain acts as a figurehead for us here in the Mishnah, and so he'll talk about the link between Ó Cadhain and Irish Republicanism. So it's really like that.
Gramagaí a bhuichasta tá shaol a bheith caint faoin gainach. Is dói go leor agaí beolalas agaí faoin Máirtín Ó Cadhain go mór sibsiúil gaige agaí ach is dói nach mistalún ní do ra bheith a bheith caint ar a ríist agus a ríist eile tá rudí le fólam an way the gcónaí. I suppose for people who don't speak Irish, Máirtín Ó Cadhain would not be as well known. Probably you will have heard the name, you will have heard he's a very well-known writer in the Irish language. You probably would have heard he had an involvement with the Republican movement, and that's the kind of the aspect of his life and his work that I'm going to be going into today. I think one of the things that it's good to clear up first off is the idea that Máirtín Ó Cadhain was a lifelong Republican, because he wasn't. I always find it a bit strange when people are described as a lifelong Republicans, like they kind of came out to the womb as fully formed Republicans with a Easter proclamation instead of an appy and all that kind of thing. It certainly wasn't the case with Máirtín Ó Cadhain. He had to make his way to Republicanism and later on made his way away from Republicanism, split from the movement, was publicly quite critical of it for a large part of his life, and in the latter period of his life returned to the movement. I think what's interesting as well is at the times when he was a Republican, his republicanism wasn't the same. His understanding of what republicanism meant, what it entailed, changed and developed at different periods of his life, different parts of the history he lived through, which I think makes it a bit more complex, but also more interesting, and maybe there's more for us to learn from. We're actually, by pure coincidence, this would be the centenary year of when Máirtín Ó Cadhain became a Republican. 1925 is one of his first kind of introduction to Irish republicanism. He was born 20 years before that in Connemara near Spidsale, and he wasn't born into a Republican family. There wasn't a hugely strong Republican tradition in that area. He grew up in the period of 1916, War of Independence, Civil War, and so on. But that area was not. It certainly was affected by what happened in those years, but those struggles weren't particularly prominent in there as much as they were in other parts of the country. He tells a story that at the age of 16, himself and a friend of his went to the local IRA, so this would have been in the sort of latter stages of the War of Independence, and kind of offered their services, but the local IRA decided they didn't need a couple of teenagers, they kind of were okay with what they had. That seems to be his only kind of brush with republicanism at this stage. In 1924, he won a scholarship to go to St Patrick's College over in Drumcondra to train as a teacher. And the regime in the college for the students was very strict, very religious, very rigorous. And one stage he tells us that he was in the study hall when he was supposed to have his nose in a textbook revising for an exam or something, and the president of the college, who was a notorious disciplinarian, caught him reading a newspaper, which was against the rules itself. But worst of all, this newspaper was An Poblacht, which is the newspaper that the IRA had just started publishing in 1925. And it's clear from that he was reading about Republican ideas, getting introduced to them. And the kind of republicanism that he would have found in An Poblacht would have been a particularly radical kind. I mean, Padder O'Donnell was the editor of An Poblacht for part of that period. There was a very strong emphasis on not just on Ireland winning independence and ending partition, but also on social justice, on the poor getting their rights. And specifically in the case of O'Donnell, I think, there was a very strong understanding of the rural poor. So the land annuities campaign was very much to the fore in An Poblacht at that time. People who'd managed to get land after the end of the land war had to buy out the landlords gradually, and the Free State government was collecting this money to send to Britain. And there was a campaign which O'Donnell was very prominent in to effectively stop paying this. And this, I think, is the kind of thing that maybe would have resonated with someone like Ó Cadhain from a rural area who had experienced very, very severe poverty growing up himself and his neighbours around him. So we know from this, and from other things he said, that he was reading about Republican ideas at the time. He didn't take any active parts in the Republican movement in his time, the 2 years he spent in college in Drumcondra. Partly, I think, because of the regime of the college. It was very strict. The students weren't really part of the life of the city. They were kind of they were kept very busy studying and very strictly having to adhere to the rules laid down by the authorities. Also, I think with Ó Cadhain's case, there's a language factor. He was someone who was an extremely good Irish speaker, and his knowledge of English at this stage wouldn't have been so good. He grew up in an area where the people didn't speak English. English would have been a language he learned at school. Before coming to St. Pat's, he'd never been anywhere further east than Galway. So he found himself amongst a lot of students who would have been very accomplished English speakers, and he wouldn't have had the same kind of grasp of English that they had. They would have had the same grasp of Irish as he had. There are some accounts that he kind of kept himself to himself while he was in college. But anyway, this is where he gets his introduction to Republican ideas. And quite soon after he finishes there, he graduated in 26, had kind of temporary teaching jobs, but then he got a permanent teaching job in September 1927 in Camas National School in Connemara, further west from where he grew up. And quite soon after that, so we're talking late 27, early 28 probably, he joined the IRA. And he afterwards described what it was that caused him, his reason that he did this. He said, Tá sam céir de thugs an IRA be hain, bechal treads le ma winter, boich na tuchia óschads. Which would be, I know what it was that brought me into the IRA. A fight was needed to liberate my people, the poor of the countryside. So there's a couple of things there. First of all, this is not any kind of romantic nationalism. This is not kind of inspired by the great history of Ireland's heroes. It's a very practical attempt to deal with the problems that people faced in Ireland at the time in the 1920s. Also, he's quite candid there that when he talks about his people, he didn't mean the Irish people, the people of Ireland as a whole. He meant people, poor people in rural areas, people like himself in Connemara. That's what he understood. He quite openly said he had very little knowledge of urban life at that stage, and looking through the walls of St. Pat's didn't give him an awful lot then. And of course, Drumcondra, being outside the canals, was in the countryside back then. Anyway, it's interesting, I think, that at this time he decides to put his Republican ideas into practice by joining the IRA, because there were other options available for someone like him. So Fianna Fáil had been set up in 1926, and the vast majority of the people who had opposed the treaty in 1921, 22, 23 had gone with De Valera, who was a very successful party. In the elections in 1927, Fianna Fáil had 12 seats. They were now in touching distance of Cumann na Gael, the government party. It would only be a few more years before they'd be in government themselves. So many Republicans were attracted by what Fianna Fáil was saying, and in terms of someone who was ambitious and wanted to get ahead, who maybe wanted to look for political office or whatever, would be more attracted to Fianna Fáil. The fact that Ó Cadhain wasn't, I think, showed that his republicanism was of a different kind. Also, I think significant is it's the IRA he joins, not Sinn Féin. Sinn Féin was a political party, and relations between themselves and the IRA were not good at this time. The IRA saw itself, and it wasn't necessarily a difference between political and military. The IRA kind of was far more practical as an organisation. Sinn Féin tended to talk about republicanism in the abstract, about how wrong partition was, about how wrong British rule was, and everything would be okay if an Irish Republic was established. Whereas the IRA took a part in everyday kind of problems and struggles that people had, and were far more active. So I think this was a kind of the republicanism that Ó Cadhain was interested in, was an active kind rather than the more kind of purist, abstract kind that Sinn Féin were putting forward at that time. Now, we have a fairly good idea how many people were involved in the IRA with them locally, because the IRA at that time kept very, very good records, very precise statistics, which is a lot of historians have been very grateful for them ever since. In an inspection report, the leadership in Dublin sent someone down to inspect the Connemara battalion in 1930, so soon after Ó Cadhain joined. And they found at that time that there were 67 volunteers in the battalion. They had 32 guns between them. They would have had more, but one member had emigrated to America and people lost touch with him, and he hadn't told them where he buried the guns. Maybe they're still there somewhere, fair enough, we don't know. In the Camas company, which was where Ó Cadhain was living and working, there were 13 volunteers. I think it's worth looking at An Croc, the company there, that would cover Ó Cadhain's home place. There were 15 volunteers, and 5 of them were new recruits. And I think that quite possibly is due to Ó Cadhain's influence. He would have been, recruiting people in his home place as well as further west in Camas as well. One of the things they're involved in at this stage is Costa Queen and the Nóblach, which is a committee set up to erect a memorial to Republicans in Connemara who had died in the Republican cause. This would be the kind of thing that could be done openly and allow the IRA to actively kind of spread their ideas amongst people and hopefully recruit. And it was broader. A lot of Fianna Fáil people were involved in that committee as well. there was no big kind of break between IRA and Fianna Fáil. They had a lot in common. They would have found common ground on various issues still at this time. The year after that, in 1931, the IRA launched its own political party, Saor Éire, with a very left-wing programme, an openly socialist programme essentially. O'Caghein's involvement with this was very little. He seconded a resolution at a meeting in Connemara. But no one really got a chance to have much involvement with Saor Éire because it was shut down very quickly. There was a Red Scare launched by Cumann na nGael, by the Catholic bishops, by the press, and the IRA decided, oh, this is a bit too hot to handle, and shut down Saor Éire almost as quickly as it was started. So what happened was in 1932, a general election came along. The IRA essentially decided that they would work for a Fianna Fáil victory. They canvassed and voted early and often for Fianna Fáil in the idea that it would advance their cause. Republican prisoners would be released if Fianna Fáil got into power, which happened, but also they hoped that Fianna Fáil would maybe improve the situation, make it easier for the IRA to operate, maybe bring things a bit closer to their goal. Shortly after that election, O'Cadhain moves to another job in Carnmore, just east of Galway, in an area which was kind of semi-Gaeltacht, Clare Galway at that time. Interestingly, shortly after that, there's a letter that came under the area of the Galway City Battalion of the IRA. Sean McBride writes a letter to the officer commanding that battalion. Sean McBride at this time was the adjutant of the IRA, kind of deputy leader essentially, and says, I understand Máirtín Ó Cadhain is now in your area, you should link up with them and get them involved. So he's been noticed at high levels in the organisation as a promising, effective IRA volunteer. O'Cadhain was involved not just in Carnmore in that area, but also involved in politics in Connemara over the next few years. What's very interesting, I think, in that period is in 1934 he's involved in a remarkable campaigning organisation that emerged called Windsor na Gaeltachta, who were essentially, it was largely made up of people who were in the IRA, that certainly the core of the people were, but they raised issues which were very, very sort of close to the hearts of ordinary people in Connemara, which really addressed the social and economic problems they had. The main thing they demanded was land in Meath. The land, there was a large population in Connemara, people didn't have enough land, the land there was very poor, it was next to impossible to make a living from, so there was endemic poverty in the area. Emigration was the only kind of hope people had for the most part. What this campaign demanded was, there's land up there in Meath, owned by landowners, they're not doing anything, it should be given to us. Now the Land Commission for the past 10 years or so had been kind of handing out bits of land here and there, buying them off landowners and that kind of stuff. What they demanded was a group of Connemara families en masse should be allowed to move to Meath where this good land was and be able to exist there. And they had a very imaginative campaign. They held meetings all over Connemara. They went to the Hill of Tara in Meath to a kind of photo opportunity to look down on the land in Meath and sort of essentially say this should be belong to us. They organised a bike ride from Connemara to Dublin, and they met De Valera, had a meeting, and they put the case of them. O'Cadhain didn't have the energy for the bike ride. He got as far as that loan and got a lift the rest of the way. But and this campaign was successful. In 1935, the Rockara and Gaeltacht in Meath was set up. A couple of dozen families from Connemara were given land in Meath, and to this day, there's a Gaeltacht still survives there. People whose grandparents, great-grandparents came from Connemara in the 1930s still live there in an Irish-speaking area. This is kind of, in a way, this is possibly the biggest victory of the past 100 years the Irish language had, after a whole history of the Gaeltacht and the Irish language being pushed back into smaller and smaller, poorer areas. People actually managed to reverse the process to a small extent. Windsor na Gaeltachta was also involved in other campaigns. There were local landlords in Connemara who had exclusive fishing rights in rivers, and people, they were involved in what later would be called fishing, just going in and defying that and just deciding to fish wherever they felt like, refusing to accept the claim of the landlords to own this land. People were imprisoned as part of that campaign. In amongst all this, in 1934, Ó Cadhain was elected to the Costa Graha, or the executive committee of the Gaelic League as well, called the aige. So very busy activism on social and economic issues. Now, this is a kind of a bit of an exception because the IRA in general was not involved in this kind of work at the time. In fact, this was precisely the time when the left of the IRA had become so frustrated with the lack of engagement in these kind of issues that they set up the Republican Congress. Very leading figures, people like Pat O'Donnell, I mentioned earlier, Frank Ryan, Mick Price, very well-known Republicans, decided that a separate initiative was needed. Now, the thing is, although Ó Cadhain was involved in stuff very similar to the Republican Congress, although the Congress newspaper praised the work of Mháirtín Ó Cadhain to the hilt, Ó Cadhain himself had no involvement at all with the Republican Congress. He wasn't part of that move in that direction. Actually, sort of ironically enough, his advancement in the IRA came about because he wasn't. There were 3 officers in the Galway IRA who signed the original manifesto of the Republican Congress. Because of that, the IRA kind of decided to demote them. And the new office commanding of the IRA in Galway was Máirtín Ó Cadhain as a result of that. All during this period, Fianna Fáil are in government since 1932, partly because of the help the IRA had given them, but the tension between Fianna Fáil and the IRA was growing. People began to see that maybe Fianna Fáil wasn't going the way they were going, they wanted them to go, the IRA wasn't being allowed to develop and to organise as it would like. This comes to a head in 1936 when Fianna Fáil actually took the step of banning the annual Republican commemoration of Bodenstown, the Wolfe Tone's grave, and not alone banned it, but arrested people trying to get to it, including Ó Cadhain and a group of Galway Republicans who spent the night in the cells when they tried to get a train in the direction of Bodenstown. And this kind of mirrors, in a way, a sort of microcosm of this tension between Fianna Fáil and the IRA can be seen between Ó Cadhain and his employers. He's a teacher in a national school at Carnmore, the local parish priest was the manager, the Bishop of Galway was the patron. Bishop of Galway at that time, Thomas O'Doherty, was extremely Republican, even for a Catholic bishop, was very, very anti-Republican. The general thing that would be said by the bishops was Republicanism was grand up till about 1921 or so, but everyone since then is wrong. Thomas O'Doherty was different. He said they were all wrong. Going back, Wolfe Tone was wrong. Everyone was wrong. So Ó Cadhain had often had stand-up rows with the parish priest in front of the kids in the school about political matters, and I think the banning of Bodenstown almost gave a signal to the bishop and the priest, now's the time. So as Ó Cadhain was coming home after a night in the cells, he heard from people coming home from Mass, the priest is after saying from the altar that you've been sacked. So he lost his job. He had a right to appeal to the bishop, which was a waste of time, obviously, didn't change the results. There was a lot of support from in the area. Some people kept their children away from the school. It took the parish priest a long time to find a teacher who was prepared to take Ó Cadhain's job. When he did come in, that teacher was beaten up by local Republicans who spent time in prison. But Ó Cadhain didn't get his job back. And of course, understandably, a teacher who'd been victimised by the Catholic Church was unlikely to get a job anywhere else in the profession, as the schools general were under church control. So he ends up moving to Dublin, 1936-37, does a few bits of jobs here and there, nothing too steady. In a sense, this is when he starts writing short stories, as he said himself, because he had nothing better to do. But he's very active in the Republican movement in Dublin. And here, of course, he's in the very centre of the movement, the part of the Republican movement which has an even greater involvement with politics. These are the people who publish the newspaper of the movement, the people who put forward the ideas, who kind of articulate the philosophy of the IRA. He becomes very involved centrally in it. He's a recruitment officer for the Dublin Brigade initially, and shortly after, the officer commanding of the Dublin IRA, a fairly senior position. Now, of course, in the midst of all this, one of the big issues exercising Republicans was what was happening in Spain. Franco had organised a revolt against the elected government there, and essentially a revolution had happened in response. Many Irish people went to take part in the fight against Franco. Ó Cadhain didn't. Ó Cadhain had no involvement, as far as we could see, in any work supporting the Republican cause in Spain. He was one of many Republicans who was sympathetic to the Republican side in Spain, but thought, we have enough to be doing here in Ireland. We have problems of our own. If we all get involved with Spain, who's going to fight for the Republican cause in Ireland? But I think what's very clear in these years is he's clearly moving to the left. As I said, when the Republican Congress was around, he didn't take part. Sierra wasn't really involved for the short time that was around. But you can see in what he's saying at this time that he's moving to the left. He gives a speech at an Easter commemoration in 1937, and he refers to the new constitution that De Valera was bringing forward. And one of the things he says against it, one of the criticisms he makes, he says, would it give a remedy for the basement slums in Dublin, or find employment for 26,000 unemployed? So he's critical of this constitution because it won't bring about a united Ireland, a free Republican Ireland, but also critical because it won't solve the social problems which people are dealing with in Ireland at the time. And specifically refers to Dublin. He's not just talking about rural areas anymore. His knowledge and his vision is going wider than that. The following year, in another Easter commemoration speech, he says, our republic will not allow people to wallow in luxury while slums and unemployment exist. So his idea of republicanism is not just Ireland being completely free and independent and united, but also an Ireland where social inequality is not tolerated, is put an end to. So this is, I think, considerably to the left of what he was saying only a few short years before even. He was, at this time, was sharing digs in just off the South Circular Road with some other Republicans, Pedro Flaherty and later Bob Clements, who were very prominent in an attempt to give the IRA a new direction. The leader of this attempt was Sean Russell, been a Republican for some time, and he was campaigning within the IRA that they needed to launch a bombing campaign in England. That there's been too much kind of involvement in politics and standing in elections and all that kind of stuff. The IRA needs to get back to what it did best, become a military attack and take it to the heart of the enemy. There should be a bombing campaign in England. And the people Ó Cadhain was staying with were involved in this campaign, so was he. In April 1938, an IRA convention took place and they won the argument. Russell became the chief of staff of the IRA and an army council was elected who were committed to launching a bombing campaign in England. Ó Cadhain was one of the people on that army council. So as part of that, he sent over to England later in the year to have a look and see how the IRA there, what state they're in. A couple of other leading Republicans do the same. He comes back and he has his doubts. He sees that the IRA in England isn't in a fit state to launch a bombing campaign. They have a fair few guns, but obviously a bombing campaign needs bombs rather than guns. But essentially the structure of the organisation of the IRA units in England isn't going to be able to withstand this campaign, is what he says. So there's an Army Council meeting in December 1938 where they're basically taking the final decision to go ahead with it. Ó Cadhain disagrees. He says we should postpone this. They're not ready to do this. The IRA in England not ready to do this. But also he launches another kind of objection to it. And the minutes of the meeting quote him as saying, he considered political freedom without economic freedom useless. The proclamation which was announced in the campaign spoke about Ireland's right to independence, but there was no reference to social justice. So from that point of view, Ó Cadhain also objected to that, to the campaign, not just on logistical grounds, but political grounds also. He lost the vote, however. He resigned from the Army Council. So I think this shows the fact that he resigned from the leadership of the movement at the time, how seriously he took it, and how important the left-wing views, the kind of left-wing republicanism he now espoused, how important it was to him. He's still involved in the Republican movement after this, but obviously not at quite a higher level. He tells a story of himself and another Republican going out to the Dead Man Murray's, which is a pub out in Lucan, still there. And on the last tram back, they were under the influence of intoxicating beverages, and they all started shouting up the IRA. Some people joined in, but anyway, the word got back to the IRA leadership, and the two of them were suspended for bringing the IRA into disrepute. We don't know who the other person is. It could well have been Brendan Behan. Maybe that's just too obvious a guess. But he was there at the time. It could well have been him, and it sort of sounds like the kind of thing Brendan would have done. But anyway. The state certainly still regarded Ó Cadhain as a prominent member of the Republican movement, and this is very obvious at the start of the Second World War. Shortly after the start of it, they rounded up Republicans to intern them, and Ó Cadhain was one of the people who was interned. He obviously didn't expect it, and I don't think Republicans generally expected it, because he went to work, at that time he was working for Unfáinne, the Irish language organisation, their offices in Parnell Square, and the special branch detective just walked in and picked him up. He was put in Arbor Hill prison with a large number of other Republicans. He was the adjutant of the Republican prisoners there, a fairly senior position. There's on his file, there's a copy of a letter he sent to Éamon de Valera warning of a hunger strike by some prisoners demanding to be released. But quite soon all of them were released. In early December, the Supreme Court found that the internment was unconstitutional. They didn't have the legislative basis to be interning people, so they were all released in early December. It didn't take them long, obviously, to sort of change the law and make it constitutional. So in the meantime, for the next while, Ó Cadhain is essentially on the run. We don't quite know exactly where he was or what he was doing. We can see some of the things he was doing, though. He I think was obviously writing for a newspaper called War News, which the IRA brought out, a legal newspaper, which there are some copies still remaining. There are articles in there in Irish. Obviously, none of the articles have any names on them; they're all unsigned. But the Irish in there looks an awful lot like Ó Cadhain's. I think it's fairly safe to assume it was him that wrote them. Something a lot more practical as well. Just before Christmas, 2 days before Christmas, 1939, he was involved in the raid on the magazine forts in the Phoenix Park, which at that time was where the Free State Army essentially kept most of its ammunition, and the IRA overpowered the guards and walked in and cleaned the place out, and kind of in a way were too successful because they had so much, they didn't know how to keep it, and the state got most of it back very soon. But Ó Cadhain was prominently involved. Apparently he said he was one of the first 4 people in there. On his internment file describes him as taking a very prominent part in the action. The magazine fort, I think, is being developed now as a visitor centre, so hopefully the tourists will learn about Ó Cadhain's involvement with it there. He gets caught in April of 1940, and what happened there was Tony Darcy, a Republican hunger striker, died in that month. Another Galway man from Headford, and Ó Cadhain gave the oration at his funeral, a very short oration because the authorities tried to stop the funeral taking place, and he only managed to get a few words out and escaped from the cemetery in Headford, but soon after that day was arrested and brought to the internment camp in the Curragh, where hundreds of Republicans were interned during the Second World War. And from the state's point of view, this internment was very successful. Internment, obviously, in many cases hasn't been successful in preventing the Republican movement. Sometimes had the opposite effect. But in the Second World War, it actually succeeded in kind of putting an end to the Republican movement's activity, more or less. At that time, I think the support that the Republicans had kind of narrowed down already, and the war did more so. For the most part, the vast majority of people, I think, went along with de Valera's policy that they wanted to keep out of the war and stay neutral, and there was a danger that whatever the IRA was up to might somehow drag them in. So there's very little support for Republicans at that time, and so those who were interned found themselves quite isolated, demoralised to a large extent, and the movement outside, such as it was not in a great state. Ó Cadhain described in 1942, I think it was, they read in newspapers about the death of Michael O'Flanagan, a Republican priest from Roscommon who died, and had been a long-standing Republican, but some people in Sinn Féin thought that he wasn't a Republican because he had broadcast on 2RN, which was a Free State radio station, and by broadcasting on a Free State radio station you would somehow betray the Republic. And Ó Cadhain says we were reading stuff like this and thinking, what the hell are they thinking? Here we are shivering and starving in a prison camp, and they're deciding how many angels dance on the head of a pin, that kind of thing. And you know, even the fact of just having so many people put together in an isolated space, kind of living in each other's pockets, would have led to irritation amongst people as well. Hundreds of men, there's no women there to talk a bit of sense to them. They're kind of, people fall out, personal and political grudges kind of come up top of it. The story isn't great. There's a very big split takes place in the camp. Ó Cadhain was involved in a lot of the kind of educational efforts. So, for instance, well known, he was involved in teaching Irish. People came out there were people who went into the Curragh without a word of Irish and came out with some of the best Irish speakers in the country, largely due to the classes that Ó Cadhain organised. He tended to focus on the more advanced Irish speakers. He was also involved in classes on philosophy and history and politics, and he wasn't wasting his time. But there was this. It led to dissension when there was an attempt to try and discuss a way forward for the movement. There's a discussion group set up, and Ó Cadhain puts forward proposals for discussion, and these were not necessarily him saying this is what we should do, but this is what we should be talking about. And one of the things was, first of all, Republicans should accept that from a military point of view, they weren't getting anywhere, so the guns should be put aside for the time being and try and concentrate on spreading Republican ideas. One of the suggestions he made was that perhaps Republicans could try and enter the forces of the Free State rather than have nothing to do with them. So Republicans could, for instance, join the army. Republicans join the civil service. If there were Republicans in these institutions, they might have an influence. They might maybe act to push them in the Republican direction, win people over to Republican ideas. It would make it more difficult for the state to repress Republicans if Republicans were involved in these kind of places. It was a suggestion anyway. But when a movement is in a bad way like this, when it's kind of isolated and losing, it's very difficult for people to sort of openly accept new ideas. The tendency often is for people to turn around and say, "Oh, that's a betrayal of what we've been doing. We need to stick to the same ideas of what we've had for years and years." And that's what happened to Ó Cadhain. People pointed the finger and said he was betraying Republicanism. The things he was suggesting was entirely beyond the pale, and there was a split. People, Ó Cadhain and people who thought the same way as him were kind of ostracised, and they set up another separate group. Another split took place early in 1944. They were given separate accommodation in separate huts in the Curragh. So at that point, essentially, he's broken with the Republican movement. The Republican movement doesn't really want to have anything to do with him. He's still interned, though, and I think one thing that bears repeating is that at any time through the years he was interned, he could have signed out. There was a form which any internee could sign, repudiating the Republican movement, promising not to have anything to do with it, turning their back on it, and if they signed that, they would be released, no questions asked. Ó Cadhain refused to do that. As far as he was concerned, that would have been a betrayal. And he was in the Curragh until July of 1944. He spent over 4 years there. One of the last ones to be released, obviously the state kind of didn't see him as some kind of innocent ex-Republican who was going to be no danger to them. They kept him in there quite late. And when he comes out in 1944, he's not involved in the Republican movement, but then there is no Republican movement at this stage. Not even the kind of skeletal structure. There's no kind of army council. There's no group of people claiming to organise the IRA. The kind of the continuity of previous IRA structures was gone. After a couple of years, there were attempts made to revive that. Ó Cadhain didn't take part in these attempts. He's kind of he seems to have had enough of the Republican movement for the time being. He spoke of what happened when Sean McCaughey died in 1946, another Republican prisoner who died on hunger strike after being brutal treatment. And he said, when that happened, Facus de chuid go muin der roads der ray, ní resagoric o nídig fehdo ach slobberna no hangover. It seemed to some of us that that was the end of the road, the end of an era. The struggle from 1922 was only a hangover. So his entire generation of Republicans kind of were almost a lost cause. They'd given all their effort to this, and it wasn't really worth it. That's the way he's seeing it. His only slight involvement with Republican politics is in 1950, when he gives an affidavit, an eyewitness account of the killing of Barney Casey from Longford, a Republican internee who was killed in 1940 in the Curragh camp by the Free States Army or military police. He gave an account of what happened as part of an attempt, part of a campaign to try and get the case reopened and an inquiry, which wasn't successful. But that's all his only slight connection with the Republicans at that time. Interestingly, when Clán Poblachtánach is set up at this time, 1946, he isn't involved with them, he doesn't join them. And a lot of people like him were. There are a lot of people were former Republicans, people who had been in prison. An awful lot of them were teachers. These were the people who set up Clán Poblachtánach. Someone who fits O'Caighan's profile would have very easily fitted into Clán Poblachtánach, but he didn't. Maybe he was kind of disillusioned with politics in general. He certainly wasn't a big fan of Sean McBride, who was leader of the party. When he was the leader of the IRA, O'Caighan didn't have a very high opinion of him. But one thing he did agree with and support, when Clán Poblachtánach went into government in 1948 with Fine Gael and Labour and a few others, one of the things they did was, at least in 1949, proclaimed the 26 counties to be a republic. Now, the attitude of most Republicans to this was dismissive or even worse. It made no difference essentially to the position of the 26 county state. It just changed the name, and a lot of them were insulted that they were just claiming to be a republic. How could you have an Irish republic which only covered 26 counties? O'Caighan, on the other hand, was very taken with this. He described it, he said, it is something of which every Irishman should be proud. He described it as a near revolution. He compared it to things like the Land War. And he wrote that bit in that opinion of it in a memorandum he sent to Noel Brown, who was the Minister for Health, Clán Poblachtánach, the Minister for Health in that government. And O'Caighan was very taken with Noel Brown for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because he launched this crusade against TB, and obviously many families in Ireland at that time had been ravaged by TB. It had affected his sister, Atrachta Ní had died very young with TB. So it was a personal matter for him to see a Minister of Health who was taking on the issue seriously. Also, in his work, in the publicity around that and his other campaigns, Noel Brown used the Irish language, and he took the language seriously. O'Caighan's brother Joseph went in to the Department of Health to give him Irish lessons. And O'Caighan supported Noel Brown when he resigned in 1951, the big scandal over the mother and child scheme. The doctors and the bishops opposed it. Brown was forced to resign. O'Caighan publicly campaigned in support of Noel Brown, which was a dangerous thing to do, because by this stage he was working as a civil servant. He was working on the translation staff in Leinster House, and he wasn't supposed to be involved with this kind of thing. He later on told that he was given a copy of the directive to civil servants preventing them taking part in current political controversy, and he said, well, this directive is written in English. Oh, we haven't got to translate it into Irish. Okay, well, give it to me when it's in Irish. And because he worked in that section, he was given the job of translating it. He put it on the bottom of the pile, and it was a long time before that got translated. But his opinion of republicanism in this period in the 50s is quite low. He, at one point, he describes the way himself and people like him were involved in the movement, and says, it's already been said that is the tragedy of our times. It was really the issues that he was mostly involved with in the 50s, and very strongly, very radically involved with, very active around, were to do with the Irish language and the gaol. And he quite openly said, there is no point to Irish independence if the language goes. If Ireland isn't prepared to defend its own language, its own culture, what's the point of it having its own state? An independent Irish state which speaks English is meaningless. If that's going to happen, we'll end up going back into the United Kingdom, and we may as well. He was very bitter, and the idea of national independence to him was meaningless if it didn't mean cultural independence as well. In 1956, he is very bitter. A book was published around that time called Staraí na Tras Brigade, a history of the 3rd Tipperary Brigade of the IRA in the War of Independence. And he wrote then, Ní dóigh gredin tú, chéad na déadach a gredin terra sail shot, good of you than Tras Brigade a drud croga a yana. You probably don't believe, who of us could believe these days, that it was worth it for the 3rd Brigade to put up their brave fight. So he's actually gone further. Even in the War of Independence, the Tan War, he's saying, well, that wasn't worth it either. Not just his own generation of Republicans, but the generation before, the people who fought the British Empire to a standstill. There was no point. Again, this fits in with this idea that there's no sense to Ireland having its own estate if it doesn't have its own language. This kind of starts to change later on. Around this period, obviously, this when Republicans get militarily active again, from late 56 onwards, there's a border campaign. This seems to have had some effect on O'Kane's opinions gradually. In 1959, Seamus Ó Cadhain died, who was active in the Tan War and the Civil War, and a friend of O'Kane's. He was asked to speak at his funeral. And when he did, he praised Ó Cadhain and linked him with not just the Republicans of that generation who fought the War of Independence, but the Republicans of his own generation, and he mentioned them by name, Sean South and Fergal O'Hanlon, the 2 volunteers who had been killed in the attack on an RUC barracks on New Year's Day 1957. So he's now prepared, he's now kind of speaking in kind of praising tones of Republicanism of not just his own generation, but also the current 1950s Republicans as well. So there's a beginning of a move towards them. The following year, this becomes more explicit. 1960, a man called Tugann Ó Cadhain, who had been very prominent in the IRA, in the Belfast IRA in the 1940s, he published Hor Mahalava, his memoirs, and he was very, very dismissive and contemptuous of his years in the Republican movement. He spoke very insultingly of Republicans and of the whole notion of Republicanism, and he had said openly at the time the book was published that he hoped that people would learn from his mistakes and have nothing to do with this Republicanism. O'Kane was given the book to review, and his response, it's a kind of a visceral Republicanism comes to the surface. He saw he didn't want to do this. Whatever his differences with Republicanism, he didn't want to end up like one of these professional anti-Republicans, which was what O'Hid was at that time. And he defends the IRA against its attack. He wrote in that review, Ní raibh drama le nar linne is fuidse, ná is mó a dulling son na héireann ná iad. Nobody in our times has suffered longer or more for Ireland than them. And it's the kind of the suffering is what he's praising them for. It was put to him as a response to that review, well, is there any chance they will be successful? What's the point in a military campaign which is unlikely to win? And he admitted in a response to that, ní mód a gnéiro leis a warigim. Violence probably wouldn't be successful. But nevertheless, because the IRA were doing something, whether it would be successful or not is kind of a secondary issue. The fact they were doing something, no one else is. Everyone else is maybe talking about a united Ireland. They're the only people doing anything about it. So in that sense, you can see he's a far more positive take on republicanism by 1960. And in the couple of years after that, this becomes more open. In 1963, he gives a talk on the bicentenary of Wolfstone, and he openly says in that talk, Is Poblachtánach mé hain, níor dhéal mé riamh chun na státaí atá sa tír seo agus tá súil am nach dhéal. I'm a Republican myself. I've never surrendered to the states which exist in this country, and I hope that I won't. So he's openly describing himself as a Republican, openly rejecting the northern state and the southern state, and putting himself on the side of the people who are fighting for a republic. It's interesting, I think, some of the things he's saying in that talk, in the light of what would happen soon afterwards. He talks about the north, and he says, Cresin nach rochor atá chuid sa haolaí an tuaisceart críochta, is cosol freisin nach iad aléachra Cathalicach aram hasna ans tús hithe, rudí iad sin of nach bhfuil bainte bheith leis I believe some of the constituencies of the north aren't drawn too fairly. It seems also that Catholic veterans of the English Army don't get priority for houses. However, those are things which have nothing to do with the border. Now, this is the time when the sort of civil rights movement was slowly starting to gather pace. And within a few short years, this is exactly what would cause the northern state to explode. The fact that the demand for fair votes, fair houses and so on was too much for that state to take, and its reaction kind of put that through the whole state into question, and the border as well. But Ó Cadhain rejected the idea of a republicanism which would be based itself on these kind of civil rights issues. So I think you read the situation wrong in view of what happened a few years afterwards. But I think it's a kind of expresses the idea that he had no time at all for the notion, which would be mentioned then, has been mentioned various times since, that a united Ireland will come about by the growth in the Catholic population in the north through increasing birth rates and so on. The idea that republicanism should be identified with one community in the north, and that community should become bigger than the others, was something that went against him. It's sort of that's got kind of wolf-tone republicanism. The idea of Catholic, Protestant, and dissenter was something that appealed to him, and he said in that talk, "Níl Seymour Beham in Mionachma Credzivs the Sheikh. I have no interest at all in a religious minority in the 6 counties. As far as he was concerned, the Irish people had the right to independence. It shouldn't be based on the grievances of one particular community." Now that talk was organised by the Wolfe-Tone Society, which was the beginnings of kind of trying to attempt to renew republicanism, to bring in new ideas to the Republican movement. He ends that again by explicitly showing his support for the republicanism of this generation of the 60s. He said at the end of the talk, "Ní waro for Sean South abroad, mar sé ira tone ira a young wall. Sean South will never be killed because he is the inheritor of Tone, his worthy inheritor." Now, the connection between Wolfe Tone and Sean South is that both of them fought for Irish independence. Both of them were involved in a military fight for Irish independence. But then the differences are quite large after that. You've got Wolfe Tone, who was kind of believed in the revolutionary ideas of his day, the French Revolution and so on. Sean South was not a radical thinker at all. He was very opposed to left-wing thinking. His belief was for Irish freedom and no big change in the social setup. Tone wanted to unite Catholic, Protestant and dissenter and overcome those religious divisions. Sean South had been involved for some years in Maria Duce, an organisation which believed the Catholic Church didn't have enough power in Ireland, that it should have the status of an official state church. So there's a lot. I think when you look at those differences between the two of them, the kind of republicanism that Ó Cadhain is supporting in 1963 is a very basic kind. It's just Irish independence, full stop. The idea of social change, the idea of even kind of religious of equality for people regardless of religion doesn't necessarily come into it. It's a fairly kind of low-level republicanism. That changes, I think, as the 60s go on, and this I think is one of the most interesting things about Ó Cadhain. The radicalism of the 60s was something he wholeheartedly embraced and was part of, which is not supposed to happen. You're supposed to get conservative as you get older. You're supposed to. At this time, he was a lecturer and later on a professor across the road at Trinity College. When you become an academic, you're supposed to leave all that kind of radical stuff behind you. Ó Cadhain got more and more radical the older he got, not just in his ideas but also in his actions. So there's hope for all of us, yeah. In 1966, for instance, he's got to the stage where he describes himself, and this is a lovely phrase, as Marxach wall, a Marxist after a fashion. He didn't believe in the entire philosophy of Marx completely. There would be points of it he would disagree with, but the kind of revolutionary fighting spirit of Marxism was something that he identified with. In that year, 1966, there's a kind of an anti-commemoration. There's the official commemoration of the Easter Rising. There's people who are using the occasion to commemorate the Easter Rising and say that the state in the South has betrayed the ideals of 1916. Mishnach was set up in the 60s. Members of Mishnach went on hunger strike to protest against the state's betrayal of the ideals of 1916. And you see Ó Cadhain at this stage moving way beyond the Irish language itself. From saying quite shortly before that that the Irish language was the main issue, he sees it as part of a wider range of issues which need to be tackled together. And again, this is the kind of the political atmosphere of the 60s. By 1969, he's involved in a civil rights movement which emerges in that year. Who stood a candidate in the election of that year. Ó Cadhain is very involved in that. And talking about that campaign afterwards, he says that amongst the things that they were talking about in their campaigning was shaol, the reconquest of Ireland, the teachings of Connolly. Now, the reconquest of Ireland was obviously a pamphlet that Connolly published in 1915, and the reconquest of Ireland, he explained in that, was the idea that Ireland should belong to its people, not just politically, not just there should be an independent Irish Parliament, but the resources of Ireland, the land, the economy, the means of production should be owned collectively, democratically by the Irish people. And this was the idea that Ó Cadhain was prepared to embrace by this stage. And the ngluaiseacht na gaige, the ngluaiseacht stray is an example of that. There's a few copies if anyone wants to pick one up. A talk he gave in 1969 where he brings all these ideas together. And what he advocates then in that talk is shaol na hÉireann and réabhlóid internet agus réabhlóid anima, réabhlóid a gcúrsaí muoine sheilbhe agus Máirtín. The reconquest of Ireland, the revolution, a revolution of the mind and a revolution of the soul, a revolution in matters of property, ownership and living. So the kind of change has moved very quickly from just an independent Ireland to an entirely different social system, a socialist Ireland. Again, you can see this in September 1969. He gives a talk at a Republican commemoration, and this is shortly after the North has exploded. And he deals with the problems in the North, and he says the barricades in Bogside and in the Falls, the IRA and nationalist guns in Belfast and Derry are the answer. He's very supportive of the people who physically defended their areas against attack. He pointed out that the Free State didn't do anything, which he said should come as no surprise because there's so much injustice and inequality in the South that they're hardly going to tackle injustice and inequality north of the border. And then he makes a claim on behalf of the Republicanism and defines its object very clearly. The Republican movement is a socialist movement. Its object is equal rights and equal opportunities for all. It aims at overthrowing capitalism and establishing an Irish Republic. We must restore to the people of Ireland all the wealth of Ireland. Capitalism must go as well as the border. And he said that the vision they were working towards was éire a bheith níomh an gaolach ach sir, agus níomh an sir agus gaolach ach bhí éire chéimse choníola Poblachtánach. An Ireland which will be not alone Gaelic but free, and not alone free and Gaelic, but will be the Ireland of James Connolly, the Workers' Republic. So a very explicitly socialist republicanism is what he's advocating at this time. Around this time, end of 1969, early 70, the Republican movement splits in what became a very profound split between two sides, officials and provisionals. Ó Cadhain himself was on the official side of the split, but I think it's important to remember to try and see things as they were at the time. Looking back, these splits often seem a lot clearer than they were at the time. things are kind of confused and fluid and people change, and also people are not necessarily wedded to one side or the other of the split. People can be, you know, oh, I'm on this side, but I still think they have a point and we should try not to fall out completely, we can work together. And of course there's then people who don't belong to either side and just don't want the split to happen. Later on these things became very, very clear and very pronounced, and there was very bad blood between two sides, but at that time it wasn't so. There's an interesting, shortly after his death, Tasson Branagh, who was very prominent on the provisional side, an editor of their newspaper, and Poblachtánach, bring back the old name, he describes going in to visit Ó Cadhain in the Mater Hospital. He was quite ill at this time, and he gave him a copy of a Poblachtánach, and Ó Cadhain was very pleased to get it, grant. But he noticed on his bedside locker he had a copy of the United Irishman, which was the official newspaper. So he was friendly with both sides. He wasn't, you know, I'm on this side, you're on that side, you're the enemy. As far as he was concerned, people, you know, there were differences there, but there weren't reasons why people should be falling out completely. In what he's saying and writing at this time, he's often asked about the Republican movement of the 30s, and he gives a very socialist interpretation of it. His reading of it is very much on the side of the left, even though at that time the Republican Congress and so on, he himself wasn't on the left. This is how he saw it looking back. He's in an interview shortly before his death, he was asked about the North, and as he said he was on the side of na dramani atá na stráidni atá gur zarvu gur ein tíreháin I éire. The groups on the streets who are trying to affirm that Ireland is one country. He was asked in that interview, would he be prepared to launch a military war against England, and he said yes, and said would you be prepared to do that now, and his reply was any time it could be done. And the interesting thing is that his own opinion here is contradicting the official line, if you like. The position put forward by the leadership of the officials was the North needed to be democratised. Civil rights should be won at this stage. Other things come. We shouldn't be talking about United Ireland. That will come afterwards. Once we've got civil rights, unionism will collapse and unity will come about. Then, after that stage, once unity come out, then we can talk about a socialist Ireland. Ó Cadhain was kind of collapsing them all together. As far as he was concerned, the idea of a military struggle, of independence being won by a military struggle, was something that they weren't into. That was, as I say, the official leadership. On the ground, many officials had a more kind of nuanced approach than that. But I think what Ó Cadhain was saying was kind of contradicting the official line that was coming out. He was not saying these things belong to different stages. He's saying they all go together. We're not just talking about civil rights, we're talking about the whole thing. Capitalism has to go as well as the border. So all those three stages are all one thing. So I think it's a legitimate question to ask whether Ó Cadhain would have stayed with the officials, or whether he would have been some kind of disagreements arose later on. He died in 1970 in October, so we don't really know how things would have gone, but that was the opinions he held at that stage. So I think, finishing up now maybe, I think the situation you have there is kind of, here's someone who took an interest in republicanism as a student, who was involved in the IRA, became a local leader, became a leader at a national level, disagreed with the leadership, fell out with them while he was interned during the war, was very bitter towards the Republican movement and to the whole notion of republicanism for a time, publicly critical of it, but then returned to republicanism in his later years. And when he did eventually move towards what was an explicitly socialist republicanism, which was more than just national independence, but the idea of profound social change and economic change in Ireland. And I think the kind of things that Ó Cadhain came up with, the kind of challenges he discussed and dealt with, address a lot of the issues that anyone who looks for radical change in Ireland has to confront. So I think from that point of view, he's an interesting figure to look at, and there's, I think, hopefully a lot we can learn from him still. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.